Hi and welcome to the Art and Science of Being Human. Today I have my friend Brad Mossing on the show. Thank you, Brad, for joining us.
Oh, thank you for having me.
To give you a little bit of a background on the context of this video, we had previously recorded another video on non-combat military PTSD, and we interviewed a gentleman who gave a little bit of insight and awareness on what it's like to still have PTSD symptoms, but not have been in combat in the military. And the goal of everything that we're doing is to bring awareness to these different types of mental health issues that people are having. So we recorded the video and I started sharing it in a lot of different forums. And I shared it in a women veterans group. And to my surprise, somebody actually made a pretty negative comment about the video because it wasn't a woman that we were interviewing, and it didn't cover military sexual trauma. And so she had mentioned that this video actually triggered her. So, being a human behaviorist and having just such a general curiosity of humans and why we do what we do, I turned to Facebook to just get some feedback from what other people think. And I'm not talking about maliciously putting something out on Facebook or putting something out on Facebook that's really opinionated, that's meant to trigger people. But how many times do we share our opinion with no malicious intent, thinking that it's going to bring a positive thing about, and oh my gosh, before you know it, somebody's triggered.
Absolutely.
And someone's been upset, and just wondering a little bit about where people think that responsibility lies, or who I hate really saying responsible, right? Because that's not generally a fair term, but
Correct.
we just want to bring awareness to the situation and what can the triggerer and the triggeree do to have a greater sense of awareness so that we can work through this a little bit better and bring people together instead of creating arguments.
Oh, I agree. I mean, I kind of live my life the same way. Is I try my best to at least understand where people are coming from. Everyone has different experiences, obviously, if you're in the military, in combat or out of combat, or whether or not you were a victim of sexual assault. You just have to understand where people are coming from when they react to what you're telling them.
Yep.
Obviously, a person of sexual assault, or a victim of sexual assault, I should say, if you're groped, you're going to go ahead and react differently than someone who has never been sexually assaulted. That's just understandable. And you might make a comment without knowing the context of it, of not knowing the context of their reaction. So it's really a matter of what that person's past experience has been, and that kind of gives you color on why they're reacting the way they're reacting. That's my personal thought.
Yeah, and so how Brad ended up on our show is that he commented, and we had a lot of very absolute comments like, if someone's a victim of trauma, it is absolutely not their fault when they get triggered, or it's everybody's responsibility to be in control of their emotions. And so there was a lot of hard-lined opinions. And again, I didn't put this out there because I was offended or upset by the situation. It was more of a general curiosity. And so Brad made a comment that was very middle of the road that I loved. So I'm going to have him talk a little bit about that comment.
So basically, the way I understand it is you can be offended. Well, first I want to make the difference between being offended and being triggered, okay? Being triggered is a very visceral response because you've had some trauma in your life. That's how I define it. Versus being offended is you just don't like somebody's opinion, okay? You can be offended or triggered over anything you want, okay? You could not like that I'm wearing a blue shirt. That could trigger you, or that can make you angry or offended, okay? I'll sit there and think, why in the world do you hate blue? Maybe you're from some country with a communist flag there, or a super oppressive regime that you had a terrible experience with. Maybe they all wear blue uniforms, okay? I don't know that. How am I supposed to take that into account when I'm meeting you? So it's me understanding that, hey, maybe that's where you come from, and then that person has to also understand, I had no idea. So that opens a pathway for conversation to say, okay, I understand where you're coming from, I understand where I'm coming from. No harm was meant. It might just come from a place of ignorance. Not like you said, Amanda, that's different when you're going out and purposely trying to rile people up and saying definitely, Blue's the only best color in the world. Because it's the best color. If you're offended by it, you're a moron. That's not a good way to approach anything, in my opinion.
Absolutely. Absolutely. But yeah, so what are your thoughts on how both parties could be more aware to help each other out?
Best thing you do is ask a question. Don't assume you know what somebody's thinking. Okay? Someone might say something that you disagree with, whether it be right wing, left wing, pro, anti-military, whatever it may be. You might assume you know where they're coming from, but it's always best to ask them and say, hey, why did you say that? Why do you believe that? You reacted this and it made me feel X way. Why is that? They might have a completely different response for you. So do your best not to assume someone's trying to offend you or someone's ignorant about X, Y, or Z. Just make the assumption that they have a different perspective than you do and a different experience that you have. Therefore, you should ask them, and maybe your assumption's correct, but at least you know that for a fact and you can go from there. And then once you know what that different perspective is, you can drill down to see what it is.
Yep.
Maybe you were raised in wealth and maybe they were raised in poverty or vice versa. It's just a matter of different life experiences and different belief systems as you grow up and as you develop into an adult.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. So thank you for that. So one of the principles that we live by around here is that education bridges the gap from anger to understanding. And so what we're going to do is we're actually going to bring in human behaviorist expert Kellie Stewart, and she's going to talk to us a little bit about the science behind being triggered. This is Kellie Stewart. She is an expert human behaviorist from Australia, and we are so excited to have Kellie join us so that she can actually explain the science behind why people are triggered, what a trigger is, and some ways that we can bring awareness.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for bringing up this topic. You know, like, it's actually quite a touchy subject, as you can imagine. You know, when people are triggered, it brings up all sorts of things within inside a human. So one of the things that we want to look at when you're actually being triggered is it really the responsibility of the person that's in front of you that you perceive is actually causing you to actually have the triggering response, right? And so I want you just to sit and think about that. Like, what does that mean if somebody was actually to trigger you? Is it them that's actually triggering you, or is it something inside yourself that is actually giving you the response from an internal visceral component that is just a feedback mechanism? One of the biggest things that we have to deal with these days is about people's opinions actually being projected upon us, right? So when we consider that each person is an individual on this planet and no two people are really the same, so do you think that it's actually something that is fair that we can consider that each person should actually be aware of the state of mind that we're in and what's important to us?
That doesn't seem very realistic.
No. And one of the biggest things is that every person on this planet has something. They all have something within inside themselves that they actually get triggered by or offended by. And that those two things are actually just traits that are actually awakening you to a particular thing. Now, I'll get into that in a minute. Let's just look at that. They are just traits. They're expressions of emotion. Now, emotions are just feedback to let you know that you have an imbalanced perception on what is actually occurring for you. One of the biggest things that with working with a lot of people that have reactions around specific things that we can label as triggers is that we notice that what state of mind or where they're actually stemming from within their brain or their mental capacity. It's not degrading or any shape or form, because we're all human and we all do experience these particular emotions or expressions, and we're never going to get rid of them. They are here to stay with us for the rest of our lives because they're actually of service to us and to the outside world as well. So my suggestion is that we want to learn to actually love those traits or those expressions because they give you a beautiful sense of feedback. And that feedback is actually letting you know that what that particular person is that you might be labeling, oh my God, they've offended me or they've triggered me, is letting you know that there's some kind of unintegrated emotion or wound that is within you that has not been brought to a state of love and gratitude or an integrated state of mind. And to take it a little deeper, when we have the reaction, a reactionary component is actually stemming from what we call the animal mind, or the amygdala, or the limbic system. And so it goes into fight or flight. And so when we come from that state of being, then that's where we get reactionary, right? So what we do with the work that we do is teach people that when we have these triggers happen is to stop and actually like come back to a sense of self and get really present with what is that person actually expressing to me, and get specific in that. And then we derive a trait from that. And then we look within ourselves where and when we have actually expressed that trait ourselves too. Because that is in actuality what we're actually trying to avoid, the actual expression that we haven't learned to love within ourselves. So it's a beautiful feedback mechanism to let you know that you have not loved the very thing that you're judging that person for.
That is beautiful. And to put that into a little bit of practical application, and just to be totally vulnerable on camera and be real, when I offended this woman, or I triggered this woman, then I too was triggered at people having triggers. And at first I kind of put myself up there like I would never let someone else's behavior affect my emotional state because I'm beyond that. But in all actuality, it's exactly what I was doing. I was being triggered by her being triggered. So how funny is that?
So this is the infinite component of what happens. You get triggered, somebody else gets triggered. It's a trigger fest, right?
Trigger fest. I love it.
So, but we can also ask the question, what is specifically that we're being triggered by? How is it actually being of service to us? Right? Because it is. It is bringing, we could say, from this particular event, because I got to experience you going through that. And some of the benefits that actually occurred during that is that we actually started to actually have a dialogue around the behaviour that was occurring, and also the expression of the way that it came, and how people actually project their opinions, which is not right or wrong, it's just a form of expression. And then, here we are doing this beautiful little podcast on it. But one of the things I want to bring up is that most people, let's talk about opinions, most people will project their opinions onto somebody when they're standing for something, right? Or they're standing against something. So anytime we're actually standing for something and standing against something, we're actually splitting the polarities. So we understand that we become polarized in our beliefs and our values, and then we project that upon others and expect others to actually live inside that value system. But realistically, that's unrealistic. We want to actually look at if a person has a certain sense of drivers or values or belief system, that's intrinsic to who they are, and honor them for that. That's important to them. Now, I always like to say that I prefer to actually do the dance with these particular stances. I would prefer to actually teach people around, let's look at the benefits of both sides, of standing for and standing against, but also looking at the drawbacks of standing for and standing against, which becomes a dance within that. And it's a communication process. Once we understand a person's intrinsic drivers or their values or belief systems, then we can really open up a dialogue and comprehend and come from a place of empathy where they're actually coming from. And that is much wiser to actually come from that state of being. Now, that's the interesting part, is that once we actually step away from the reactionary component, we step into response. And response is then opening up our prefrontal cortex, which opens our awareness to a greater sense of consciousness. Then we can actually connect with that person at their level. And it doesn't become this standing for, standing against. It becomes a dance between each other, and you start to flow in communication, working towards a greater sense of transformation or a greater sense of consciousness. Like, it opens up an awareness that it actually helps people to heal the processes within them that these wounds are actually stemming from.
Beautiful. I love that. And so we've talked a little bit about, if I've been triggered, And so my takeaway from this entire experience was, which ended up being really beautiful, is that the moment I feel triggered, I know that I have an imbalanced perspective, and there's some questions that I can ask myself, like, what is it about this event that has triggered me? What am I charged on? And where can I find the opposite in that same moment, right? So that I can bring my nervous system into a state of balance. But additionally, can you speak a little bit to, because it's interesting that I've played both sides in this, right? I was the triggerer, and then I became the triggeree. But, you know, like we talked about, it's absolutely unrealistic to live your life always walking on eggshells because of fear that you might trigger someone. But let's just say I'm the triggerer, I've just triggered someone. What can I do in that moment for myself and for that person that will take this into one of those empathetic situations versus, you know, full on, you know, cyber combat?
The quickest thing that you could do in that moment is stop and take a moment in between before you actually step into reaction or response, and connect with your physiology and look for the feedback that you're getting in and from you throughout your whole body, and then determine the perception that you are actually judging on that person that is creating your trigger. And then from there, I would recommend that you ask the question, what is it specifically in that person that is actually I'm triggered or charged by? What are they doing or not doing that is actually triggering me or charging me up, right? Determine that in that moment. And then we ask this beautiful question, where have I done that? And who have I done that to? Because anytime you're actually having a trigger charge, you're actually judging somebody outside of you for something that you perceive that you don't do. But when we really truly look, we all do it, because humans are made up of traits, and there is a beautiful study of traitology that we can actually derive this specific component from. Each human actually exhibits in excess of more than 4,700 traits, and we have all of them. We're not going to actually get rid of any of them. We're not going to actually, like say that we don't have them, or I'm not going to do that. We all express them in our form in relation to our values and our drivers and our belief systems. So again, coming back to your question, the simple question is, ask, what is that person specifically doing or not doing that is triggering me? And where do I do that? And who do I do it to? And in that moment, it actually neutralizes a charge within you, because you're releasing the judgment towards them and also the judgment within yourself. So there's a little bit of neurochemistry that happens within the body, and you talked about how it actually does calm the central nervous system. So neurochemically, that's what's occurring. You're actually calming your autonomic and central nervous system when you simply ask that question, which is perceptional, and your perceptions are what drive your emotions. Absolutely.
And just to add a little bit to that, one of the things I was able to do also in this situation is say, okay, and it's the irony of it is a bit uncanny, but a great example. But I had to own that and say, okay, well, where do I allow someone to trigger me, which was clear in this situation. But then I took it a layer deeper and I said, why? Like, why did I get triggered? What specifically was it that caused me to react in that way? And it was simply that my values were being challenged. So I had challenged her values, which is why she was triggered, and then I got triggered because my values were challenged. And when I can look at it from that stance, I come to a neutral place of, it wasn't her fault, it wasn't my fault, it was just an exchange and an experience that happened for us, not to us, to grow a little bit more and find a little bit more compassion and a little bit more awareness and understanding that we're all just people doing the best that we can.
Absolutely. It's a reflective component of human nature. What you see in others, you have in yourself. That's the laws of reflection and transparency right there.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much,
You're
Kellie,
welcome.
for coming on
You're welcome.
and giving us some science behind the why. And we will see you guys next time. Thanks for tuning in.